This is your last chance. After this...
Or should we not follow the advice of the galactically stupid?
That is a nice boulder.
Ludicrous speed! Go!
Ladies and gentlemen, coming to you pre-recorded from two undersized apartments in New York City, it's Revenge of the Film Nerds.
There, we're in a tight spot.
I hate when people talk during the movie.
With your hosts, Black Crystal.
I'm not bad. I'm just drawn that way.
And Jack Manley.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
A podcast for nerds by nerds.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Failure is not an option.
And now, here are your hosts, Black Crystal and Jack Manley.
Hey, what's up, guys? Hello, and welcome to Revenge of the Film Nerds. I am Black Crystal, and tonight I have been joined with the lovely Jack Manley, and we're going to take on a really, really awesome film this week. Jack, you got to let them know. I know now this is literally in your top, so the listeners got to hear you actually geek out. Tell them what we're going on about this week.
We are, BK, about to go quite literally and figuratively on a journey through the heart of darkness, because we are going to look this week at 1979's Apocalypse Now, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and co-written by Coppola and one of his buddies from his film school days, John Milius. I gotta start this by being very clear. For anybody who knows me, this is about the most obvious 10 out of 10 I'm going to ever give. This film is a fundamental part of who I am as a person. It is at the core of why I love movies. And a lot of that has to do with my experience seeing it when I was younger. But that brings me to an important point, is BK, you had not seen this before. So you came into this cold pretty much.
Oh my gosh, let me tell you. What an experience. I was cold turkey and specifically said, just don't tell me nothing to you, Jack. I was like,
yeah, couldn't get a word in edgewise about this. You would stop me when I would start my rants.
I'm like, okay, cool, because I don't want to go into it with any expectations. And I'm actually very glad I did, because this film was an experience. That's honestly the word I would use to describe this. I wish I was alive and old enough to appreciate it when it came out, but looking at it at the state that I am in now, it still has crazy impact. And I think that impacted my rating, and we'll get into that later into the show. But I think, Jack, you've got to let the viewers know, listeners, I should say, I'm already thinking ahead when this is on the big screen.
Hey, onward and upward.
Right? You got to let the listeners know the story behind this. That is honestly what got me so invested, like after the fact. Like, I experienced the movie, right? I'm in my feels. I've been overwhelmed. It's like 2.5 hours long. My God. And then Jack's over here telling me the ins and outs of the production behind this and the story and how it came to be. Now, please, you got to let him know.
It is a story of a film that was almost as crazy to make, if not crazier to make, than the actual story ends up being. And this all started with what was considered to be an impossible challenge. Is the very basis of Apocalypse Now has roots back in Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, which was written famously with its subject being the rape of the Congo by Leopold II and Belgium when they occupied that territory at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a notoriously hard novel to tackle because there is so much symbolism and so much depth to the descriptions in that book of the madness that the characters go through as they go up the Congo River, that it had been for a long time seen as a project that could never, ever be developed. And yet, Francis Ford Coppola would challenge his friend John Milius during the day, sort of right after they had come through film school. Coppola was kind of the first film school kid. And he sort of laid down a gauntlet to John Milius that he could not adapt Heart of Darkness. And Milius, being a quality writer and director in his own right, took that upon himself and came up with the early rudiments of this script to the point where this is what got the project essentially up and running and got it greenlit.
Right. So, Jack, you mean to tell me, so this was like a challenge, is what you're saying? Like, okay, let's see you try to make Heart of Darkness into a motion picture.
Absolutely. And it's something that came about, I think, in some ways, and this is, a little bit of analysis because I obviously don't know Mr. Coppola.
Right.
But he was at sort of the height of his powers when this got greenlit in 1976. He had gotten notoriety in his film school days at UCLA for directing a film called Finian's Rainbow that was very artistically lauded. It was considered to be a real indication that this kid was a young talent that had to be paid attention to.
Like he was it. You got a prodigy.
And then, of course, he would bear out that prodigy status because he would do, in 1972, he would direct The Godfather. In 1974, he would direct Godfather 2, and he would follow that up with the very tight thriller, The Conversation. So Coppola could have gotten anything greenlit at this point, and he decided to go to United Artists for funding for this film, knowing that even despite the height of his powers, this was a film about Vietnam. And in the 1970s, BK, Vietnam was considered an untouchable subject by the studios.
Okay, I see now. So that's how this relevance is huge then for a type of film to even get greenlit about the very war itself.
Is absolutely. We were just when the film was beginning to come about in 1976 and 1977 when it would ultimately be shot. It was only, 12 months maybe after the last chopper left the embassy in Saigon, the famous image of the United States retreating from Vietnam. And so when the production started in the Philippines, this was a raw wound for the country, as we had never been involved in a conflict where we did not understand the parameters of engagement like that. We had never been in a conflict where we had taken losses like that, where we would do military operations where we would take hills in the middle of the jungle and then our troops would leave and a month later those same hills would be occupied. So they were going into this film in a very raw way. But as we have discussed, that rawness is really the tip of the iceberg when this film got going. It was absolutely rife with some nightmarish difficulties in getting made.
I can see that. And when you started to tell me the ins and outs of this the first time, I immediately connected the dots. Like, it's not that this is something very hidden. I think it's very prevalent throughout the film. I mean, literally starting from the beginning. So, and with that, I kind of think about that intro there and how that moved me. And I'm really eager to get into because I want to know the technical aspects behind it, but also I kind of want to talk about how it made me feel.
Absolutely. Please, feel free to expound upon that because there is some history of the making of the film regarding the intro that is very crucial and adds into the madness that we will be discussing about this film. But as somebody who is now just, very shortly coming off their first viewing, what was it about that opening that really struck you?
Oh man, I remember telling you right after, I was like, the helicopters, bro. Like, I can't. Like, I was triggered. Like, actually triggered. I don't know. It's the sound, but coupled with the sound, the visual aesthetic, let alone the music that starts playing. It's that slow burn that I'm typically not like keen to. I don't normally resonate with slow burns, but the pacing of the chopper spinning and the propeller, like, I don't know, it put me in this like trance like state, and I feel like that's definitely what it was intended to do.
Trance is the perfect word there. Is that the opening of Apocalypse Now is a series of happy and very unhappy accidents. For one, in terms of the good news here, is that the famous shot to open the film of the helicopters moving past the tree line that eventually erupts in an explosion of napalm, that was a B-roll shot from the famous taking of the village that happens in the first hour of the film. This sequence was one of the many roadblocks to making the film, is that the production had access to 18 choppers from the Filipino military. This whole film, by the way, was shot in the Philippines. And they had access to 18 military choppers, but were consistently stymied and even ripped off at times by the Filipino government and by Filipino businessmen. During this production, there were military actions that would go on, which would require the use of these helicopters. So in the middle of a shooting day, these helicopters would fly off to go on assignment. There would be times when they would pay the helicopter operators, and then a day later, the helicopter operator, seeing that they had this, influx of capital, would refuse to work because they had already been paid. And on top of that, that village had to be constructed and reconstructed several times because the amount of destruction that was put on display, absolutely shredded. And I can't stress this enough. This was a real built village that it had an expanse of at least a quarter mile around where they shot. And so it would be blown up and then built again over, half of a day's worth of time.
Oh my God, Jack. Oh my God.
But during this process, and this is the amazing thing, is this is the depth of coverage and the depth of finance they had, is while they were doing this, they were setting up cameras around the village for B-roll, for just essential, throwaway shots that they could put into the film if they needed that time. And one of these shots just so happened to be B-roll of the tree line that would form the foundational overlay of the fading in and fading out shots in that intro.
Wow.
Of course, this fades us into our main character at the beginning, Captain Willard, Martin Sheen, who in the opening sequences of this film was going through it.
Oh, that is an understatement, Jack. He was, oh my gosh, he was all up, lost in the sauce, all up in his bag. I don't know what he was on, between drinking, between who knows what, and also just straight up trauma and PTSD. My God, my heart goes out to him, Jack. My heart goes out.
It does my heart goes out to Martin Sheen for this film as well, because I know he, like so many of the crew, had a very rough time, and that might be an understatement. Is Sheen in this role? He came in as a fitness nut at the age of 36, very in shape, very in tune with himself. And during this production, he would go through a lot of genuine physical trauma, starting with the shattering of the mirror at the end of this sequence. I don't know if you know this, BK. That was his actual fist hitting a real mirror. That was not faked, nor was it an intended moment within the script. It's something that came primally from the trauma he was experiencing in that role. And as you saw, that it's something that you don't see, and thankfully I think don't see in film these days, because actors, I think, are better looked after, as are all crew. But the blood on his bed in that scene, that's his real blood. The anguish and the pain he's going through is the real pain of having shattered glass cut up his fist and his forearm. It's one of those things that it goes to show you it's a small incident compared to what would happen to Sheen during the production, but it's a real raw moment of pain that brings you into this film in a very real way. It's a visceral, unhappy accident, but it is an accident, like many things in the film, that aids to the overall air of horror.
Totally. Horror is definitely the word I would use to describe the start of the film. Horror, realism, and it's odd now because this is me experiencing it, but I feel like that moment happens where it's so traumatic. Honestly, they give the viewer trauma in the first few minutes of the film, and then these guys show up, right? And it's very like, come downtown, let's get him up. Oh man, here he is, drunk again. Very comedic, if you ask me.
Well, you notice that throughout the first hour is for the seemingly normal parts of the film, when Captain Willard is being given his mission by the army to go up the Mekong River to find Colonel Kurtz. when he is introduced to the PT boat crew, these youngsters, FNGs in the terminology of Vietnam, who, as Martin Sheen's character describes, have, 1 foot in the grave already, young boys who don't understand where they are.
Right.
Even in meeting Colonel Kilgore, Robert Duvall's famous character and his famous role that often defines this film for a lot of people, there is a real air of levity, of the idea that these guys are going to pass through a war film. And they're going to pass through a war film in the way that it had been seen in, traditional World War II films. It was, Americans being celebrated as heroic victors, heroic conquerors fighting for a greater good. And in fighting for that greater good, it's a perversion of what the attitude was around Vietnam at the time, because that war, more than almost any event in our history, put a rift within the country of people who favored the action and people who were very against the war. And it was not seen as a conflict where people were, the conquering heroes. And in a way, it almost makes the first hour of the film pro-war, in a sense, even though I would argue the film doesn't really take an opinion on war in general.
Absolutely. I agree with you. We talked a little bit about that after the viewing, how it's kind of like the war is more the setting to me. The war is happening. There's definitely more of a story going on. And I do not think at one point the film does take an actual stance or opinion, although there are some very traumatizing scenes that leave you with very strong, lasting opinions. Hard to say that they weren't trying to make you moved or feel something about the subject itself.
And that's one of those things that starts to creep in the famous Flight of the Valkyries scene. This unit that Kilgore is running at the river that's supposed to help Willard and the PT crew get to the mouth of the river to get them upstream. It's almost like a beach party. Kilgore is much more enamored with Lance, the surfer character on the boat, and is more interested in the idea of finding good surf in Vietnam than he is any sort of mission or any sort of obligation to his country. You start seeing, very subtly, the self-interest of these people, the sort of, more individualistic qualities of Vietnam that would go on to identify the war compared to that collective energy of World War II, the conflict that we had as a society, spent 30 years to that point really venerating and holding up as an exemplar of who we are as a people. And here was this film starting to very subtly creep in, even though there is a sense of a unit, a sense of a camaraderie in the army. You start to see that individualism creep in. And as things go wrong in the operation, that individualism comes up more and more.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I would also like to say that, as the story does build, I kind of wanted to give the listeners perspective as to what time stamp are we at in the film when we get to these iconic scenes with Kilgore.
Absolutely. Kilgore is really, his unit shows up about 30 minutes into the film as you go through this very traumatic intro that sets you up with, Captain Willard's psyche, that the fact that he is somebody who is already inured to Vietnam. He understands the world at work there. He is already a very cynical, very sort of deafened character almost to the violence and the brutality around him.
Absolutely.
So you're experiencing the first hour of the film. When you get to Kilgore 30 minutes in, you're still looking at the film through a very cynical eye. And as you mentioned, it is comedic. Cynicism is a foundational part of comedic styling. And so because of that cynicism, you're almost meant to, as the viewer, I think, not take the situation seriously, because nothing is really there to make you seriously. There's even the cameo for Francis Ford Coppola acting as a war journalist, telling the soldiers as they take the village, keep going through, don't look at the camera, look like you're doing your job. And it's you're given this window into a very cynical view of how the conflict played out over American newsreels and through American news from the word go there. And so you are almost encouraged to not take this film very seriously.
Yeah, it was so meta. Like the jokes in the film were so meta at that point, really. I was like, is this a parody? Like again, I have no context. Like I didn't even ask Jack guys like what genre this film was. I mean, obviously I'm looking at it. It looks war. But I'm over here like the last war film I've seen, like let's be honest, is like something stupid like Tropic Thunder, all right? So like I'm going into this like this is going to be a parody and it's proving it to me literally up 30, 40 minutes into the film. So I'm like sitting here relaxed at that point, like traumatized at the beginning, and then all of a sudden relaxed and chilled. And then it's like the second movement of the film takes over, and I don't have the words to begin to describe the tonal change, coupled with the technical aspects, the character development, and honestly, the real story of the film really starts to develop after that point.
And it's great that you mentioned that you get caught off guard by it, because it was an integral part of building the universe of the film in the editing process. When he was talking to Walter Murch, who would literally go on to create what we know now today as surround sound, or really the foundational rudiments of surround sound to make this film, Coppola told him that key to the editing process for him was that the film would start out, as he put it, normal, and would gradually get crazier and crazier. And even after these great moments of almost comedy with Kilgore, you start seeing things go awry. You see that one soldier in the town square with his leg blown off being triaged and taken to a helicopter, which is then destroyed by a grenade when a Vietnamese woman comes up with a grenade literally in her hat and throws it in the helicopter, in a play on several sabotage style and guerrilla style attacks that would happen during conflicts in Vietnam. And the response is to, yes, this woman has thrown a grenade that killed several soldiers, but the immediate response is to get another helicopter immediately over her position and to machine gun her and every other Vietnamese person around her. It's a real reference to the violent nature that a lot of patrols in Vietnam would take, that a lot of military actions would take. It's the first real indication within the film that this war, this world that these characters are in, is not really what it seems. And it's right at the moment when the boat drops into the water, when it is lifted to the beginning of the journey up the river, that these things start cropping up.
Oh, and they don't stop there. That's the worst part. Because I'm like, okay, experiencing this film, like, boom. All right, we're going to take a little dark tone. I love my spoopy and dark stuff for sure. But, watching a war film, you have a certain expectation for the type of heavy it's going to be. And after kind of having that expectation thrown to the wall from the first half of the movie, as these scenes kind of start to hit, I'm starting to even question my thoughts like on the war itself and the history that I know. I told you, Jack, I confided to you, I was like, I don't really remember learning a lot about Vietnam in school at all. Personally, I don't pride myself on that, but I didn't learn too much. So, and what I do know is definitely the picture that was painted. So to see, the same pictures being painted about the Vietnam War in this film, but the realism behind it after that key moment that you pointed out, Jack, is what gripped me, actually. Because I will say I was gonna tap out. Like I was like, it better get really funny right now, or I'm out. And it didn't do funny. It doubled down and was like, no, we're going to be very nitty gritty. But definitely brought me on this adventure. And like you said, it starts on the river in Heart of Darkness fashion. And it doesn't stop at every checkpoint, right? There's something different that is done. And I definitely think, the intent behind the way this whole film was put together was definitely thought of down to every last nuance.
And it really is thought down to the last nuance. And this is a good point to bring in the cinematography work of Vitorrio Storaro, who did all of the shooting for this film. And Vitorrio Storaro is considered to be somewhat of a guru of cinematography. His book, Writing with Light, is referred to by many people as the Bible of cinematography. And Storaro himself has said many a time that his religion is light. And you see the truth of that in this film, because as it begins, it's a very muted scape of colors. It's a very, not gray certainly, but it's a very dull series of colors when he's getting the mission, when he's meeting Kilgore. This first hour of the film, it is designed with that dullness in the aesthetic, I think, to, let the plainness and the normalcy stand out. But the further upriver they go, Storaro, with his lighting, decided that he really wanted to up his contrast in colors, up the vibrance of the colors, the further upriver they went. You're getting this beautiful visual cue that the madness is taking hold, that the more that Willard reviews his documents over the mission, the more he comes to understand why Kurt's defected from the military and why he's gone AWOL in Cambodia. The more he has to expose himself to that madness, the madder the whole visual aesthetic of the film gets. And it starts all the way, as we mentioned, from the taking of the village, but it very much continues up the river when they get to the USO show. And I know, BK, this caught you totally off guard.
I was so confused. I was like, wait, what is happening? First, we should definitely mention how chaotic it was when they got to that first checkpoint. What do you call that again? What is that place called?
It was a mock-up of a USO show. It was a set designed like all of the sets in this film, these big epic production designs by Dean Tavoularis, and it was designed to really create this genuine amphitheater in the middle of the jungle as a way of bringing together the troops for some light entertainment. This is something that our military has always done, or has at least endeavored to do since the era of World War II, is we would bring over famous entertainers or luminaries, or as we saw in this film, female talent, as it were.
Yes, lovely female talent.
Playboy bunnies, more specifically, is you would see, this employed as a tactic to raise morale amongst the troops. There's a real frantic nature around this USO show. For the moment that the boat docks, they are in the midst of moving a lot of supplies around. They are struggling to get the sergeant in charge of supplies to get for the boat what they need. And it is all through this confusion that you see the military kind of come together. It's a weird way of bringing people together in this sort of frantic setup within the jungle. But you see the reason that it's so frenzied is because these are young men, no more than, 17 to, 25 years old, stuck in the middle of the jungle, starved for contact with women, being given Playboy bunnies to ogle for their enjoyment. And it's clearly something that has got the camp abuzz.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely one of those times where the film is at its most liveliness. I feel like at the start where we see that first initial troop, like it seems not lively, but full, very stacked. You could hear, and there's definitely a life to the film. And I feel like this is its weird hidden climax, because I'm very invested now in the soldier story. And I wasn't before that. I really couldn't care less. Like I'm always afraid with you guys.
You hated Willard for the first hour of this film.
Oh my God, I couldn't stand him. He could go. He could so go. I was like, I don't care about him. Like, it's fine. We get to this scene, and it was definitely seeing everyone's kind of individualistic character kind of come out with, the chaoticness of the scene. And it's funny because it's a happy chaoticness, and we get to see lots of unhappy chaoticness directly after that. So in this moment, you're very relaxed. You have this kind of chuckle with you while you're laughing at it. You're like, oh, this is cute. This is funny. This is, again, very real. The situation is very real. Like you said, Jack, this did happen. But what kind of transpires afterwards, what it escalates to, I'm not so sure is real, but more madness, more extreme version of what happened.
It's a deeply, deeply uncomfortable moment when things turn, because what starts out as, just a what is attempted to be a lighthearted USO show where three, Playboy bunnies come out and dance for the crowd and, get them, riled up and, proud to be Americans, that would, put something like Playboy into the world, very quickly descend into this seething, roaring mass. They're spitting like Visigoths over these women. And what starts out as just, some cheers and some applause turns into, take it off, baby. And, real, abusive shouts at these women. And you mentioned that you do start to see the individual characters really come out here, whereas Frederick Forrest's character, Chef, and Lawrence Fishburne's character, one of his first roles, Clean, they are part of the crowd and they are very much taken up in this spirit of almost animalism that comes over these troops when presented with figurative red meat in front of them. And meanwhile, you see Captain Willard over to the side, almost with this look on his face of he knows what's going to transpire. He knows that these men are going to get desperate and are going to literally jump in the water and start trying to rush the stage to get at these women. You see him almost adopting the cynicism we as the audience adopt in the first hour, is where in that first hour, and I think this might be part of what your issue might have been with Willard, is in the first hour, you almost don't need him as a conveyance for story because you are that observer.
Yes.
You are that person who is left to see the normalcy of a war film perverted and to make your own conclusions about how that feels. In the USO scene, with Willard viewing this, you now become an active participant in watching his journey. It's a real tonal shift that makes him integral to the rest of the plot.
I think what's so strong about this film is that sense of staggered character development. Like I'm so used to movies starting and they're like, boom, you know who your main character is. And this film, boy, does it start that way, right? Like there is no question who our MC is. But he's kind of a passive person for honestly half of the film. Even through this, the scene here, the USO scene, he still is only just getting scratched in his character development. But I think it's key is this scene is showing insight to his beliefs for the first time, is that he definitely does view the situation of the war and being a soldier as something to be laughed at. There's something very cynical about his situation. And I think that's really important to how the story unfolds, because our MC here is really trying to decide if, I resonate with this rogue combatant or do I uphold the mission?
And that's a very key point you bring up there, because one of the elements we have not discussed yet that is extraordinarily rare for a war film is this film is done with narration. Captain Willard is narrating a lot of the proceedings, especially going through the CIA documents he has on Kurtz. And I think it's a really interesting touch, because it is not narration in the sense that we are kind of used to traditionally in film, of it being used as a conveyance purely to further plot, to the point of being a crutch in a lot of cases. The narration is very clear here in that it is meant for you to find the narrator unreliable. It is very much like F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby with Nick, his central character. You're not supposed to trust Nick by the end of that novel. You're supposed to realize he is an unreliable and partial narrator. And after they leave the USO show and they continue upriver, as he really starts going through these documents, you start realizing that he is not the reliable military man you thought he was. He had not gone through this trauma unscathed, and he had not gone through this trauma and stayed truly loyal to the ideas of, the military and the ideas of the mission. He's almost going through the motions because he's so scarred and so inundated by these traumas of Vietnam that he almost knows nothing else. And Kurtz, and going through the information about Kurtz, is the first time, it seems, in a long time he has had to figure out for himself what he really feels.
Oh man, and I feel like that is really what gripped me, honestly. Like I could care less. I hate saying that. I know it's your favorite film. I feel so bad every time I say it. But I'm like, it's my experience, right? So I'm like, dude, I'm not here for it. But the narration, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I read that was added in post. it wasn't an initial thought.
100% it was yet another thing that happened between in discussions between Francis Ford Coppola and Walter Murch.
And I think it was honestly necessary. Trying to imagine that film without narration would be wild. Maybe they'd throw in a little bit more script, I guess, but it would be too late by then. I think narration really does kind of set the stage, and the tone of the narration sounds to me, what I got from it was that kind of PI, private investigator, detective tone. I bring this up because I low-key think this film does hit a lot of multiple genres at once. I think it's godly because it does that. The narration there is really, to me, is like, I just think of private eye detective, like he's trying to figure out the case. And it's odd in this film because there is no case for him to figure out. Like, you're an assassin, right? Like, you've been given an order. This is Mission Impossible status, right? You're going to go and execute, spy movie. But it's being presented as if there's some sort of mystery to uncover. I think that's just so interesting. And I noticed that once the narration started to continue and to pick up as the film further progressed down the river.
And it's an important thing to note the existence of this particular directorial choice, because, as you mentioned, doing this film without narration would be a deeply difficult thing. And in part, that is because of yet more difficulties that would transpire on set. A lot of the film had to be written around quite literal and figurative disasters, both environmental and personal. As they were going upriver during the production, Martin Sheen, who, as I mentioned earlier, was a fitness nut, had a heart attack on a 6-mile run in the 100-degree heat of the Philippines and came extraordinarily close to dying. In fact, Sheen said it was one of the most horrifying moments of his life because he realized he was reenacting the exact same death that his own mother had gone through, dying thousands of miles from home of a heart attack. And so when they're going up the river, every shot you see from behind Martin Sheen is his double. They had to find ways of shooting this film early on to cover for him. During the process of shooting a lot of these set pieces, and as I mentioned, Dean Tavoularis created probably the most intricate sets seen in Hollywood since Gone with the Wind 40 years prior. These sets that they had spent months building were completely wiped out by a typhoon and had to be rebuilt basically by hand, brick by brick. And this is where the film really started to go over budget. What had been intended to be, I believe, a 6-week shooting schedule evolved into a 10 to 11 month shooting schedule, where these people started almost living their own private Vietnam in pursuit of getting this film made. And part of that that necessitated the narration to bring things full circle was that Francis Ford Coppola was having to rewrite segments of John Milius' script over and over again, day after day, to figure out where this film would go. And while they were going upriver, part of the madness of making this film is Francis Ford Coppola had no idea how it was going to end yet. He knew that they were going to reach the end of the river, but he didn't know what was going to happen there.
You're kidding. I had no idea. You're serious?
100% is Coppola would continually confide in his wife, Eleanor Coppola, who has compiled as a journal her full experience on the film, and it's a worthy read if you can get your hands on it. But he would constantly confide in her that, I just can't do it. I don't know how to do it. He was having a real crisis of faith, and Coppola was starting to go through what would become a truism about the film, is that he would later go on to say himself that it's a law that anyone who works on Apocalypse Now for any length of time becomes insane. And this was really the, inflection point of his insanity. The madness was not just increasing after the USO show as they started heading up the river to the bridge. The madness was increasing in the actual making of the film in tandem while this was going on.
That's crazy, man. Put another level to method acting, why don't you? Method production? Is that is that what we call it? I mean,
it's fairly well discouraged at this point, I say, as we thankfully modern film has safety safeguards and best practices and things that you can, put in place to avoid this. But this was the 70s. This was the era of New Hollywood when, as I mentioned last week when we reviewed Alien, the inmates were allowed to run the asylum, and this was probably the craziest asylum that was run in the 70s in the pursuit of making art.
Oh my gosh. I feel like after hearing what you said there, I think I want to double down on Apocalypse Now as a good narrative for trauma and honestly mental health. I think it's a very, very good movie that tackles that topic in a very unique way and doesn't kind of embellish or fantasize anything. It actually takes very realistic approaches and angles to kind of exploring what does that look like to a wider audience.
And that plays out in the next two events upriver. Chef and Willard going into the woods, and then the encounter with the Vietnamese fishing boat. It starts off, the first of these two events is Chef and Willard are hanging out on the boat with the rest of the PT crew while they are sort of at a moment of rest by the riverbank. And Chef, who is one of these FNGs, one of these young kids from New Orleans, decides he wants to go get some mangoes. And so the head of the PT boat, Albert Hall's character, says, you can go, but, make sure someone goes with you. So he gets off the boat with Willard to go and look for mangoes. And in their pursuit of it's a very small scene. It starts out as they're going through the woods. Chef is just very sort of calmly, very almost dismissive of the environment around them, talking about his training as a saucier in New Orleans, talking about his love of food and the way that the military kind of beat that out of him when he trained as a chef. And it is broken by this sound in the jungle. Now, for those of you who know your history on Vietnam, a sound in the jungle was one of the most terrifying things you could experience during that war. Is so many of the engagements that would happen in Vietnam were literally just patrols going through a contested section of jungle, coming within inches of Vietnamese forces, whether it be the NVA or the Viet Cong, and being very suddenly thrown into an ambush from all sides where noises and bullets and just terror were coming from every angle in the jungle. And these young boys who, they were expecting, things closer to the Battle of the Bulge or, D-Day, advancements and common military plans, were suddenly thrown into these hellish guerrilla warfare scenarios that they had no frame of reference for. But in this case, it turns out to be this ever so slight moment of levity where it's a tiger.
The best part for me. I know I laugh at it, but I think that's the best part for me.
You laughed at it. You're laughing at it now, but you jumped at it last night very clearly. You had that same...
I screamed, guys. I was so... Oh my gosh. I was bitch made.
You had the same reaction that I think most soldiers would have had, is you had a real panic terror reaction to the sound in the jungle. You see the real terror that inspires when, Chef and Willard make, they book it back to the boat. And after they get back, the rest of the PT crew immediately starts to open up fire on the jungle because they think that they've run into a, VC patrol. And when it's made clear that it's a tiger, the rest of the boat kind of decompresses, but Chef doesn't. This is that moment for him almost of losing his shit, again, in the terminology of Vietnam, is he's screaming and like almost laugh crying, I just, don't get off the boat. I just want to go home. I just want to cook. And it leads to this quote that you and I both love from the movie is, everyone knows Colonel Kilgore's famous, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." But it's almost a more poignant quote of the segment is Willard says, "Don't get off the boat. Goddamn right."
It hits. Don't get off the boat. It's like, if you're going to get off the boat, you got to get all the way off.
I love the way you put that. It's a real indication that there is no such thing as a half measure in Vietnam. And that's what Willard is really learning when he's learning about Kurtz, is you either invest all of yourself in this place, you either invest all of yourself in this madness, or like a tiger hunting prey in the jungle, you will be consumed by it. And that paranoia carries over to that horrible scene of the encounter when they stop the boat along the river to do a routine check.
Oh, right, the boat scene, the boat scene. You said that was typical, right, for patrols to kind of stop any ship that they seen and like search for things.
The North Vietnamese had a very strong sense of patriotism in their fight against America. And so we would have to resort to things like basically harassing and abusing innocent villagers. And that really is the discomfort of the scene is set up immediately from the moment that they hook onto the boat, is that there is a lot of yelling in English and of token Vietnamese phrases by the PT boat crew at a group of Vietnamese villagers who clearly don't understand what's going on and are clearly terrified.
It's a very unsettling scene. It's like the OG stop and frisk, Jack. Like, we'll pull up on you with the whole boat.
Differences of perspective. I never even thought about that, but there's a lot of truth to that, and there's sadly a lot of truth in the way that the scene unfolds. Is in searching through the boat, Chef Frederick Forrest is getting more and more agitated because he understands and he knows that these people don't mean any harm. They're just, they're people trying to make a living. They're trying to get their goods upriver. They've got food, they've got, livestock. And they all they want to do is just, live their lives. And Chef gets that. But in searching through their things, he goes for a particular basket in the back of the boat. And the woman on the boat with the supplies, she makes a jump for this basket. She's clearly trying to protect something. And it spooks the PT boat crew. And they open up on these innocent people. When I say open up, I mean open up. They empty clips on this boat of innocent people.
There's a whole M4 that they just let go. And, not to mention, Chef is pretty still shook. And I think that's like a really good moment to point out is there's like visual and consistent trauma from recent trauma on some of the characters that might have not had trauma yet. Chef, for example, that tiger incident was really, I would say, probably his first cornerstone in that. And now to go off of that to this boat where he's still shook, but trying to kind of like articulate his thoughts about the whole situation, but is being put under pressure by authority to kind of react and not even necessarily follow orders, but to be very aggressive and get it done. And Chef does not handle that situation very well at all. I do give him that, that slack of being still kind of shook, but no one seems to want to really look at the situation logical. It's just this is protocol. We should have to do this because I'm scared. What if I XYZ? And I think that fear, that the what if and the whys start to kind of come out after this scene.
That was something that you said frequently while these scenes were getting crazier and crazier, is it would come back to one thought, which was just why.
I was screaming why for like, I was like, why? Why?
And I thought that was really poignant, because that is ultimately the question we as a culture end up asking the most about Vietnam, and ask more so about that war than almost any other war. Even, with modern military operations where there is a lot of public cynicism and where there is a lot of, public belief that these things are not being carried out in good faith, we still kind of get a grip on why they're happening, even if we disagree with them. Vietnam was this action taken in pursuit of this nebulous policy of containment that people ultimately didn't understand. And there ultimately was no real rhyme or reason to the conflict. And you see that here. And the irony is in this discussion of trauma and mental health, ironically, Chef's trauma makes him the most rational person in this scene. He is, telling these people that, he's yelling at them for what they've done, because the fact is that this woman was lunging not because she was trying to hide supplies for the Viet Cong. She was lunging for a puppy who she wanted to make sure could be safe when these scary men are yelling at her and yelling at, the people that she's with. And you see, after these guys on the PT boat open up, you see, hunched shoulders and bowed heads. You see shame from the crew. And yet, you don't see that shame from Chef. You see regret, and you see anger, and you see logic coming through his trauma. But the real kicker to the scene, the crushing thing, is when they realize that the woman is not quite dead yet, despite being full of bullets. Willard very calmly walks across the boat, shoots her in the head to put her out of her misery in what is a horrifying act, killing a woman as a soldier, and yet is the merciful thing to do. And he just very quietly says, "I told you we shouldn't have stopped."
And that moment hit. I was very in my thoughts about the situation, because obviously they want you to be enraged coming off of that adrenaline from the last few scenes. And our MC's actions there of putting her out of her misery was really, I think, crucial there to kind of developing his character more and showing off that, like, this type of trauma is not going to affect him unlike it's affecting everybody else. You really get to see the innocence of everybody else. And it's kind of funny too, like you mentioned, right? Like the Chef freaks out about, oh, it was just a tiger, and everyone was on the boat being like, oh, who was it? How many of them were there? And he's like, it's a tiger. Everyone starts laughing. And like the same exact situation happens, but now it's not an animal. It's innocent people.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a real window into the way that Vietnam, at very least in the accounts of veterans, it's a very poignant way of recounting a lot of the feelings that these people had, that what they did ultimately didn't have a lot of a point. All they really seemed to do was to hurt innocent people with their presence. And you obviously see that, very much played up here. This is meant to be almost a metaphorical example of the brutality that we would put upon Vietnamese civilians. But at the same time, it's this indication that even though the film is starting to get crazier and crazier, there is a level of crazy in Vietnam that could be judged as useful. And Chef is starting to discover that, and Willard has clearly already been at that point since the film opened.
I think the next moment in the film that I resonated with the most with following that is when they do manage to get to the bridge.
And that is, we talked about this, BK. That is my favorite scene in the film.
Oh, really? Okay. I didn't know it was your favorite.
It is my absolute favorite because it is the gateway into the nether realm. It is the place where those sentiments of those last two scenes, of there being real madness in play and of there being a use to the madness in Vietnam, really manifests. Is this bridge? I will get the name of the place wrong if I try to remember it, so I will just refer to it as the bridge. Is this road in Vietnam, sort of right near the Cambodian border, that is reconstructed by the military every day and blown up every night by the Vietnamese. And it is this perpetual dug-in trench warfare style operation. And you even mentioned this when we watched the scene first, is that you felt like this is more what you were used to in depictions of war.
Yeah, I definitely thought like that was the most warist scene, I think, and it definitely sent the tone there. I felt like we were very detached from the war. Even in the first scene when we, set siege on a village, I never felt like that was the war. So you get to the bridge and you're like, this is your first entryway to like the thick of it, of what is the atypical base like. And our MC there is like, I need to report in and I need to find who's in charge.
And the funny thing is that while he is clearly still leading proceedings, while Willard is still clearly leading us through the journey of the film, we're almost in this scene in a very kind of, and I mean this in the best way possible, in a very ridiculous manner. We are sort of thrust into the perspective of Lance, who confides in Chef right before they park at the bridge. I just dropped that last tab of acid I was saving. You're going through this scene almost like you're going through an acid trip, complete with distorted carnival music and weird experiences and weird sights. And there's this surreal nature to being above the trenches that you almost think for a second you're watching a comedy again. And then when they get pulled back into the trenches, because obviously you don't want to be above ground and, a target for the Vietnamese soldiers, it immediately hits this gravity and this insanity. Literal forms hanging out in the dark. People just chilling in the most hellish place as if they have become a part of not just this operation, but have become a part of the actual world. They have descended into this darkness and they have descended into this war with all of their souls. And you see that when Willard finally gets the ear of a gunner who is trying to kill a Vietnamese soldier at the wire. This scene really strikes me a lot. It starts out with a gentleman who is literally just operating a machine gun, but he quickly brings in his buddy with a handheld mortar who has maybe the scariest eyes I've ever seen in a war film.
Oh, totally. I really think that scene was gripping, to say the least. I agree. I think probably best scene in the film. Maybe later on there's one scene that takes a close second. But here, the realisticness and real just depiction, again, I hate to keep bringing it up, but like, my God, madness and trauma all over these soldiers that he meets. And the guy with the mortar, man, it was like he's been doing this 1,000 times in the same spot. And the guy's like, do you need me to shine the light? And he's like, nah, I got it.
One of I think the most striking moments in the script of the film is like when he's shooting this mortar, this guy, he spends this very silent moment as he's very focused, again, with these scary, scary eyes. He's very focused on finding his own range and firing the mortar just right. And his buddy, who had been on the machine gun, is staring at him with very kind of innocent eyes in a very pleading way as he's like, man, I need you to handle this. I don't understand. I don't know what to do here. I've been firing at this guy and I can't hit him. And like, you see real fear and you see him going to this other fellow soldier. And of course, the man with the mortar, he judges it perfectly and kills this last Vietnamese straggler who's underneath some bodies at the wire. And at that moment, Willard looks at the man with the mortar and he says to him, do you know who's in charge here? And all the man with the mortar does, he looks back at him with almost like a coy kind of smile and just goes, yeah. And it is that moment where it crystallizes these events that we've seen in the last several events off the boat. There is a level of madness to Vietnam that is useful, but it is deeply disturbing, the level of violence and the level of capability it pushes these people to access that ability.
I think it really does set the stage for the final act, I would say, of the film, because it only dives further into darkness after that. That is like the true sign. Like, we are no longer at the gate. We have crossed into the realm.
That is always how it's taken. Is that there's still this level of madness that Willard can even comprehend, but even he, by the time they get to the bridge, even he is starting to struggle with the events. But once they go into the mouth of madness, as it were, and they cross underneath this bridge and into Cambodia, therein is where the real tragedy of the film starts, is where the madness starts to claim victims. It leads immediately to the scene where, amongst the things that were accomplished at the bridge, is Willard is given new information by the CIA and is also given mail for the PT boat crew. And so as Willard is reviewing these new documents and the new developments in his mission, the crew is starting to go through their own mail, including Clean, who gets a tape of his mother. And this is probably, among many difficult scenes in the movie, BK, this might be the hardest one.
Oh, by far. I think, again, shook doesn't quite get the word across, but it's the only word I have.
But you went into the scene, correct me if I'm wrong, you went into the scene when Lance is, clearly still tripping out. It starts popping smoke and dancing around the front of the boat. You said very clearly, this is not good.
Yeah, big red flag to me. Like, I'm just like, after what we just saw, right? We are entering into madness, and now we're all like, la-di-da-di-da, let's spray smoke bombs around and let's sing a song really loud and like yell at each other and just be very relaxed. Like, I was uncomfortably relaxed.
Yeah.
And I knew something was a problem. We've just seen so many instances of guerrilla tactics gone wrong, or fear of something being a guerrilla tactic situation. And then you go to probably one of the tightest portions of the river that we really have seen for most of the time, and you're supposed to be relaxed. You're supposed to be calm.
and of course the woods, which they had been scared of during the scene of the tiger, they had actually been vigilant and scared of opening up. The jungle finally does open up on the boat, and it's sad to say, Clean takes rounds right to the chest and is DOA from that moment on. He is gone. It leads to this very tough moment that has this added political significance to it, because Lawrence Fishburne's character he's been murdered. He was Clean of anybody, was the most innocent kid on the boat, as he was a 17-year-old from the Bronx who was, in the context of Vietnam, was out in the jungle having been drafted into fighting a white man's war. And we discussed this a little bit because it's a very significant portion of the history of Vietnam. Is one of the divides that appeared in America at the time of Vietnam it was right when the civil rights era was going on, and Vietnam exacerbated the racial divide in some very harmful ways for the black community, one of which was just sending the best and brightest of a young generation of black men out into the jungle to die for an ultimately meaningless war. And you experience the tragedy of that in the first place when Clean dies, because after his death, you still hear the tape of his mother running in the background. You still hear the hopes that this woman has for her young son. And it's this crushing moment of having to listen to this woman in a very matter-of-fact, very calm way explain, what she sees for her son and what she hopes for him, and having to look at his dead body while this is going on, having to look at Albert Hall, the only other black man on the boat, come down and cradle his head and break down in tears as Clean has been lost. And it's this horrible moment. And I have to ask, as somebody of color, that moment has to hit you in a very visceral way, I would imagine.
Oh, it was, again, I think one of the most traumatizing scenes for the viewer in the film. I think there's key traumatic moments for the viewer, and that one, by all means, is. And seeing that there, you said it very well. Thank you for laying that up. It was the first guy to go, right? The most innocent, and of course, our black fighters out there, our brothers, are the ones that are first to go. And to see that happen in such a gruesome way, and then have that tape play where you're sitting there and you're like, yeah, that is the hope, right, for the soldiers to come home. But the grim reality is none of the brothers are coming home. Like, if anyone's not coming home, it was him. And that's what hurt.
Too sweet for the war.
Too sweet for the war, too innocent, too naive, to everything. And it starts to really just send home that tonal shift there of like, this is not a comedy in any way possible. This is a tragedy, absolutely. And you better buckle the hell up for the next act, because it doesn't stop here.
And not only that, it is an indication that any innocence, any sense of normalcy was left behind at the bridge. We are fully in the madness now, and there's nothing you can do. And this story, this tragedy of losing these young black men carries on into the very next encounter, where there is a group of tribesmen, as they get very close to Colonel Kurtz. There's a group of tribesmen who almost is taunting the boat as it heads upriver by shooting toy arrows at them, and really starting a genuine panic on the boat, as Albert Hall realizes that Willard, for all of his machinations, for whatever his mission is, he doesn't actually know how to take care of the people that have been charged with taking him upriver. And so, as the authority figure, Hall's character has to try and do what he can to save the boat. He, in this moment, becomes a very positive, and throughout the film he has been a very positive authority figure and a very straight head amongst the madness. And so he is felled by a spear thrown at the boat. And it is So we've seen the death of innocence through the conduit of this young black kid who did not need to be in this war. And then we immediately see the death of innocence met with a death of what we consider normal or positive authority in the death of the captain.
That's what really hurts too, is that I really started to like the captain. I really did. You really started to genuinely feel for these characters, and losing Clean really just was hit too close to home for the crew, and you could tell. And they were so, again, another chance. It's the same situation, a potential guerrilla tactic situation, one where at the start they're saying it's playful, like just don't freak out. And I think it's really key to point that out, is every time they freak out, the worst possible situation happens. And it's not like, it's not like they can help it, but every time, if they could just stay cool, maybe they'd use logic.
It's part of the frustration of the film, is that you want to believe that, you can apply logic in these scenarios. You want to believe that there is a safety or a way of saving these people. And Vietnam and the Heart of Darkness just tells you back, these people have stared into the void is staring back at them, and it is displeased. It's, the void is not going to let these people get out of this. I think the crew kind of realizes it through the story, because after Chief Phillips, Albert Hall's character, is laid to rest in almost in a baptismal way by Lance.
I'm really glad you pointed that out. It really was very a lot of religious undertones, and I know Coppola, he had a thing for rituals, did he not?
He absolutely did. He would later go on, and of course, famously in the final scene, he would be allowed to film a traditional ceremony by one of the mountain tribes of the Philippines, who would become integral in the last segments of the film as bodies within Colonel Kurtz's compound. But at this point, the ceremonial aspect that is important, because it is a resignation from the two surviving members of the PT boat, Lance and Chef, that they're on this mission too. They can't back out. They can't just take Willard up the river and then let him go and go back normally. They have to be committed to this too. They have to be a part of this madness as well. And so they send off Chief Phillips. They baptize him into the waters of death, and they very quickly after come upon the real nightmarish scenes that are Colonel Kurtz's compound.
It's so unsettling. I'm sorry. I just have to say, the compound, everything about that is unsettling, Jack. Like,
it is a moment to talk about the production design yet again, because Dean Tavoularis, like Coppola at this point, was going insane. They were just going insane in very different ways. Whereas Coppola was struggling with the story, struggling with difficulties with actors and everything that came with the production. He was, having to put up his own money for collateral in order to get the film made, as it went wildly over budget. It was a $7 million film that would end up costing $21 million, which in 1970s money is insanity. Tavoularis at the time, realized that he was sort of living in his own refuse, and he needed to create that world of refuse around him. And so the result was this very chaotic, very dingy, very hellish temple with, skulls hanging out everywhere, with, naked bodies of mutilated men hanging above the waterline. Just this scene of, real madness in the aesthetic that immediately sets up to you when the boat shows up, when the boats of the natives slowly peel out of the way of the PT boat as it comes in for parking at the end of the river.
I was so scared. I had never been scared. I was not actually scared. I was shook. I was scared when they were going through the boats.
It's this real moment of whatever you thought you were prepared for, however maddening this river has been, however crazy your journey to the Heart of Darkness has been, you're at the end of the river, and the end of the river is a beast unto itself, BK.
I don't even know where to start, right? Like, there's so many layers to this final, I want to call it almost an epilogue.
They almost give you an out early, because your first interactions are with the most hippy-dippy, most tripped-out photojournalist you could imagine in Dennis Hopper's character. Is these moments of true terrifying visuals are broken up by Dennis Hopper showing up to meet the boat and saying, hey man, it's all good, man. Just you shoot the siren, they'll put down their weapons, man. And bringing these people in. And while there is this brief moment of comfort when they get to land safely, the moment that he really starts talking to them, you realize that Dennis Hopper is following Colonel Kurtz as a cult figure. He is ranting and raving about the guy the way that you would expect a member of the former Heaven's Gate to rant about their cause.
I think it's very funny that that you mentioned that, because that character really took me off guard. Like I said, I was super shook and scared, actually, is the word I used. I was genuinely scared and in suspense. I think the first moment of true suspense happens until you meet this photojournalist who is just off the wall. And you're like, oh, this guy is all types of crazy. Like, maybe he's just all types of crazy. He's carrying like 7 cameras. Like, you have no camera cases on them. None. Just walking around with cameras. Like, something wrong with you. All right. Second of all, then you start to, work your way into the temple, and you're like, okay, this is the temple. This is like straight out of Far Cry right here. Something is going on. This is not okay. And as the elements of the compound, or whatever you want to call it, this cult community, they start to be revealed to you, like you said, very grotesque things, very morbid things that you see around as decoration, but getting introduced to what is this cult and how is it even a cult, and who is this guy? Like, is it an actual cult? Like, you start asking yourself these questions, and then you realize it's even more than that. Like, it is far gone. This is some sort of actual religious thing, like some sort of more than a cult. You know what I mean? Like, cult's unsettling, but this was like systematic. This was like of the gods.
The word that comes to mind in this scene for me is always menacing. What starts out as a sort of a very lighthearted, almost comedic encounter with the photojournalist, it's not just that the compound itself becomes more serious and more severe as they go through it. It's that as you listen to these ramblings of this mad photojournalist, they, go from, oh, he's a great man, he reads poetry out loud, man. It goes from, these very basic sort of reverential cultist tones to real menace when they are literally, like, they're brought to an image of, literal severed heads on the steps of the temple. And you've got Dennis Hopper saying, he's the first to, say, he's sad about what he did. And if you could have heard him 2 days ago, man. He it very quickly goes from this very sort of general cultish worship to understanding how deeply inured you have to be in order to be a part of this cult. He literally within 5 minutes, he is apologizing for the murder of innocents at the hands of Kurtz. And so the crew heads back to the boat to figure out what their plan is going to be, to figure out, we're confronted with this madness. What kind of plan can we put together? And the plan immediately goes by the wayside. There is no semblance of a plan. It was the moment they start walking to the beach to try and go meet Kurtz. Willard is swarmed by these cult members and basically dragged before Colonel Kurtz. And after all of this time, BK, we finally get to meet the Colonel, played to perfection by Marlon Brando. And the only way I can describe his scenes is that they are haunting.
Haunting.
And it starts out with the way he's shot.
Yeah, you mentioned that about how the angles, there were really tight camera angles. I noticed that. Also, the lighting stood out to me in his scenes as well. And I know that was intentional.
It was intentional, but in a weird way, it came about as yet another happy accident born out of crisis on the film.
Really? Okay.
Coppola did not know sort of which Brando he was going to get. He had worked with him before on Godfather and had, dealt with him as the mercurial but sublimely talented actor that he was. But as Brando arrived at set, he not only came to set massively overweight for the role to the point where it would be very hard to cast him as a convincing commando, but he came to set having not read Heart of Darkness, having no familiarity with the script, to the point where Coppola literally had to sit with him and read to him the original novel, had to read to him the story of Apocalypse Now, and almost in a way hold his hand through the process to bring this venerable actor into this world of madness that he had ended up creating out in the jungle. And as a result, he had to find ways to shoot around Brando's massive size on the set, and he found this beautiful way of doing it. Even in the first scene when he is just getting to know Willard, when he's asking him about where he's from and talking about the Ohio River and the gardenia plantation, you never see once Brando's full face in the scene. It is cast in shadows in different ways and at different angles, and you almost can't imagine the scene being shot straight or a different way, because you see almost the darkness more than you see the man. You see a man who is swallowed by his insanity and has no way out from that insanity. And it turns Kurtz from just this guy that Martin Sheen is sent to assassinate, and turns him into somebody that Martin Sheen fears and cannot fathom.
I'm glad you said that, though, about like fathoming him, trying to understand him, because like I feel like our main character has been trying to understand him from the beginning of the film, and now he's finally like confronted with him, and it's built up to be like this is a villain in a sense, and I don't want to say he's necessarily a villain, but more of a manifestation of literally the horrors of war.
And that's a great way to put it, because the horror of the situation that he has created, it first starts to outwardly manifest by, bringing the PT crew into this world. Is Lance at this point goes almost completely AWOL, as Lance is very close to becoming a member of this cult. Whereas Chef, who has agreed to go full bore in on this mission with Willard, he's fully willing to help him kill Kurtz at this point. In trying to, find the logical military solution to Kurtz, calling in the airstrike, trying to, make sure that the mission is complete, he is off screen, not even on screen. He is off screen, beheaded by Colonel Kurtz, and his head is brought to Willard while Willard is imprisoned. But when Chef's head is literally thrown in Willard's lap, it is that crystallization of there is no logic here. There is no procedure here. It is only madness. It is only darkness. And you need to understand that, because if you don't understand that, this place will swallow you whole. Look what it's done to your friend.
No, it's good that you put, an emphasis on that, because I think the tail end of this really kind of shows how our main character does, in fact, try to confront the madness, if that's how you would say it. Whether he's successful or not, I feel like is up for interpretation. But I think, to me, in leading into the ending of the film, which we'll, kind of get into, that is that end sequence into the final moment is very gripping and definitely shows really the full scope of the madness.
You see for a while after it has been made clear to him that this is a place of lunacy, you see Willard, sit with Kurtz for long periods of time, listening to his bastardized, insane philosophies, seeing how Kurtz is sort of floating through this world at the end of the river, almost, without a sense of who he is as a person, without a sense of being real. The only moments that you start to realize that Kurtz is a real human being is he does eventually ask Willard in so many words to kill him. He asks to be put out of his misery, and he does so by talking about his son that he has left behind in the United States. He talks about the fact that he wants his son to know everything, because he believes that it is a farce that he has been charged with murder of Vietnamese officials. He finds not the murder that he has had to commit gruesome. He finds the fact that the military is judging him for committing murder during a war to be truly the profane and gruesome act. And he, in almost this last moment of wanting to control his world, wanting this world of madness to give him what he wants, he implores Willard to go to his home in the States and to share with his son everything that happened, the real story. He wants his son to know about the madness his father was exposed to and went through. And it's a very peculiar moment, because you realize that for all of this cult setup, for all this cult worship that this man inspires, he wants none of it. He wants to be free, both of the military's bullshit, but also of the world that he has created in the jungle.
Or one could argue of existence there as well. He wants to be free of life, like a very big topic, in Buddhism, his life is suffering, right? So to see him be there, it was almost at the point, at a philosophical level, he was begging for his escape, which is still, again, very ritualistic, very, religious. Like all of these types of tones are now just like surfacing in these final scenes.
That's a very interesting comparison. Is I had not considered Kurtz in the role of the Buddha, but in a very cynical way, he is propped up as a Buddha by this cult. He is sitting around reading poetry, pontificating to himself, and just going through an assorted, incoherent, rambling series of thoughts. And yet he is venerated to such a degree. He really is a Buddha figure, but he knows that eternal suffering is something that he no longer desires. And so, as Willard says right before we get into the final scenes, before we get into the ceremony and the end of this spectacle, he notes in the narration, everyone wanted me to kill him, maybe him most of all.
Mm-hmm.
And BK, let me tell you something. I told you when we were watching this film, as they started getting ready for the ceremony, as this tribe was congregating around a very ornamented cow, I said to you, get ready, because we're about to go into the climax and it does not let go of you.
I think you're right when you say that the ceremony scene is the climax of the film. I see a lot of situations where kind of all of the questions I've been asking are being now brought to the forefront, and really the side by side of the ritual that is happening and the actual actions that are happening are very gripping to kind of see. And the ceremony, like you said, regardless of the nitty gritty, it is gruesome.
Let's say, for those of you who are unfamiliar or who have not yet seen this film, there is depicted a very real and very live slaughtering of a cow. And it is something that was, thankfully, it was not something done where just the production was just trying to, get some symbolic thing in there and abusing animals because of it. It was a ritual that this tribe that was living and working with the crew, it was a ritual of these people to do animal sacrifices. And it had been part of their traditions for thousands of years. And so it was almost a sign of respect from the tribe that they wanted to do this ritual for the film, that they wanted to give the filmmakers access to this. It's a brutal thing to watch. It's a real death amongst all of this sensationalized death is a difficult thing to face down, but that brutality is in a way necessary to the climax because it parallels the exact same way that Willard kills Kurtz. Kurtz's death is not a pleasant or simple matter. It's not, a bullet between the eyes and, thank you, I'm done with my assassination. He comes upon Kurtz during this ceremony with a literal machete and hacks Kurtz to death. Yes, in shadow, so you're not seeing gore the way that we are sort of deadened to gore in modern film, but you're seeing him slash at shadows and you're seeing the pain of Kurtz as he's dying. And when both he and the cow finally hit the ground, his last words are the most famous words from Heart of Darkness. He just manages to say, the horror.
And it just lingers with you for so long. And I really it just popped up into my head while you were talking about it. I'm really starting to think the true message of this film is the innocence and the sacrifice of it in war. Because the symbolism didn't hit at first, like, yeah, oh, cool, it's mirroring what's happening between the ritual and what's happening to our main character. But in reality, our villain, our cult leader, is no more than just an innocent animal that needs to be sacrificed for whatever greater cause is deemed at the time. And I think that starts to hit our main character when he kind of finishes his act.
It's a very good way of putting it, because after this act of murder that he commits, it's as though Willard kind of goes dead himself. He is in a way separated from this world, even though he is stuck in it, and he is finally, through all of his experiences and through all of his difficulties, he is finally truly horrified. And the horror only extends as the rest of the film is fairly silent. There's not much dialogue left, but he goes over to Kurtz's things as the ceremony has culminated, and as the tribesmen are indulging in this cow. He is looking at Kurtz's papers and discovers among his writings, scrawled in red ink on one of the pages that he's typewritten, "Drop the bomb, exterminate them all." And you realize, and he realizes in the film, that Kurtz is, as you said, an innocent animal. He is just as much a victim of the madness at the end of the river as anybody else. He is not a conduit that created this world. He is an almost unwilling host for the world that has been created around him. And you see Willard offered that same ability as he walks out of the temple, having killed Kurtz. Is he walks to the entrance of the temple, and the tribe bows to him
like he's a god, like they're worshiping him. And I don't understand that. It's very interesting. Like, I wonder what he's done, which makes me think about the overarching story, right? He was exiled for killing 4 of the major
players in the Vietnamese rebellion.
Yes, in the rebellion. He's exiled for that reason, right? And to me, I'm thinking about there's just these themes in the plot, and it's like, wow, well, he did something he thought was deemed right, like you mentioned, like committing murder in here. Well, they are technically our enemy. Like, why is it even murder? Why am I getting tried for it? It doesn't make sense. And I think that's super interesting to kind of bring that back to our main character's task, right, of him accomplishing this assassination, where, is any of it morally correct? Is any of it just? Does any of it even matter?
And Willard even puts that into words before the very famous shot where he emerges from the river with the camo face paint on. As he says in the narration, "They were going to give me a medal for this, and I wasn't even a part of their damn army anymore." He understands the absurdity of completing the mission, but he truly understands it now, and he truly understands how laughable it is and how ridiculous his circumstances are. But it all is allowed to hit him in this ending scene, and you see the impact of that as the boat leaves. They don't call in the airstrike. They're not able to end this madness. They were merely, he and Lance, the survivors on the PT boat, they were merely passengers through this world of madness. And it's here that you get, in the end of the film, one of the most shocking things that you can imagine in a film, is that there are no ending credits. You hear the horror one more time. The film fades to black, and that's it.
Yeah, trademark. That's it. Like, nothing. I think that was probably the most unsettling thing about the whole film. Not all the deaths on the river. Honestly, just the end of just stopping the experience. Like, it's like worse than when you're on a roller coaster, and then after you do the last twist and turn, it comes to an immediate stop. Like, that's what it felt like. There was no small little drive around back into the launching station. Like, none of that. That's what my credits are for me. No, Apocalypse Now said, we're done. That's it. You're traumatized now. Go live with your thoughts. Go think about it. And I don't know if you are going to be okay afterwards. That's literally what that movie told me.
And not only that, but it's almost this indication that, yeah, we're not going to give you traditional catharsis at the end of this film because this madness is now out in the world. We didn't have beginning credits because this madness has always existed, and you don't get ending credits because this madness will always exist.
The madness doesn't stop. And I think, the non-existence of credits in Apocalypse Now definitely sends that message home. I'm terrified. I was unsettled that whole night, Jack. I was like, I couldn't sleep. I told you I couldn't sleep last night. I'm like, why am I so like shook to the core? I just feel like it was one of the most realistic, like cinematic experiences I've had that like wasn't a documentary. Like,
well, first of all, I can only apologize for costing you sleep by showing you this.
It's okay, no worries, man.
But I will say it's funny to hear that was how it hit you viscerally, because it reminds me of my experience when I first saw it. Is when I was about 16 years old, I was at the North Carolina School of the Arts for a summer program on filmmaking there, their advanced filmmakers program, which is if you're interested in film or you have somebody in your family who's young and interested, send them there. It's a beautiful place to learn about it. But one of the things that NCSA had at the time was they had the second largest library of film prints in the world at that time.
Oh, wow.
Only the Library of Congress had more at that point in time. And so as the film library was getting ready to be split because one of the owners of it was getting ready to move their stock down to Florida, the school decided to show as many great classic prints as they could. And so I got to see this film for the first time from an original 1979 70 millimeter print.
Oof.
With Walter Murch's original quadraphonic sound mix.
Oh, wow.
As I mentioned last week, I didn't move in muscle when I watched this film. Like, it was just this visceral movie-going experience that it shaped for me what I consider film to be. Is that when I saw that, I said to myself, the first thought I had after the film concluded and after it didn't release its grip, is I said, I don't know if I know as much about film as a lot of people, but I know that film is going to be a part of my life forever because of this, and I know that I want to be creative because of this film. And BK, because it's so near and dear to me for the experience it gave me, because it is a film that literally sent me on a course in my life. There is no way I cannot give this personally 10 stars out of 10. It gets to what I talked about last week, is it's a film with a clear focus on its madness of building its world and building itself to its point, even if it's building you in a weird way to a logical point that is totally illogical. If it's building you into this world of madness, and it's showing you this world of sacrifice while the filmmakers themselves had to sacrifice to get it made. And it is, to me, to this day still, and I hesitate to say it, but it is to me a perfect film. It is what I consider to be the highest form of the art. And while you may disagree, that is how it will always strike me personally.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Okay. I see why you would say that, though, so I won't hurt you with my rating. I'm glad you've accepted this. For the BK rating here, I'm going to give it a solid 8.5.
Okay.
I think 8.5, it bumped it to 8.5 from a 7 because of its story, like behind the scenes, really like adds to the story and experience of watching it. But it's a slow burn, and like 2.5 hours, my guy, like that's not it, Chief. Like, that's not it, Chief.
I totally understand. You know, I think it is very much a film from a different time.
Yeah.
And it's worth discussing that, because I've mentioned and hinted around it before that this was kind of the pinnacle of New Hollywood, of the creatives running the studios. And it was a dodged bullet for United Artists and for Francis Ford Coppola, because it would go on to be a successful film, but it went $14 million over budget. It shot for 10 months longer than it was supposed to. It was a debacle of a production. For the great film it gave us, it was a catastrophe. And it sort of was the first sort of warning siren to the studios that, hey, if we keep giving the creatives this much free reign and this much power, this is all going to come crumbling down. And a year later, when Michael Cimino, the director of another great 70s war film, The Deer Hunter, released his film Heaven's Gate, which had also gone massively over budget. It flopped horribly commercially, and it destroyed United Artists, the film that helped finance Apocalypse Now. It destroyed it as a standalone studio. United Artists from that point on would be purely in the business of buying and selling film properties and of owning film libraries. Their production days were destroyed by New Hollywood. And at that moment is when the studio execs and the traditional power structures re-seized that power in the 80s. But Apocalypse Now was the canary in the coal mine.
That's a good analogy. Like, that's a very good way to put it. And I think it warrants high on my list because it was an experience and definitely a slow burn of a film to still keep me interested and have so much to talk about it. Definitely warrants a fairly high rating in my book, even if it isn't my preferred subject matter. So I definitely say Apocalypse Now is a film you have to watch at least once in your lifetime. If you like movies, you got to do it. And I would encourage any American, just for its cultural and historical significance, to watch it. Really, there are so many forms of medium that use this as reference. I mean, this is seen in anime and in video games, direct scenes and parodies off of this film. This film really kind of set the stage for tons of things that we have in our pop culture now. So, anyone who's a nerd like me, I'm telling you, after seeing this, there's so many references you're going to get now. I mean,
just to hit on it real quickly, BK, to back up what you said there about these endless series of references, the film itself would give definition to a lot of cultural references that already existed. Like, the end by the Doors is forever tied to this film. Flight of the Valkyries, even despite the fact that Wagner was, sad to say, a composer favored by the Nazis, even Wagner, his Flight of the Valkyries is more synonymous now with the helicopter raid in Apocalypse Now than it is with Nazism. These cultural references that existed were enhanced and were given new meaning by this film, and that might be its most poignant significance at the end of the day.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's one of those things where it's like, you got to just do it for the culture, guys. You got to do it for the culture.
And at the end of the day, I'm glad that this film struck you as highly as it did to get you to that 8.5, because I knew in suggesting this that it's a film that not everybody resonates with the way I do. I know it's a tough film to get through. One of the first comparisons that you made after seeing it was you compared it a lot to Schindler's List, where it's a vital film to see, to have that knowledge, but you almost can't envision yourself watching it a second time.
No, I can't. It's one of those things, like, if I could go back, wipe my memory and watch it another time, yes. But after you see it, it's such an experience that it's hard to even really watch again if something doesn't really reach out to you. And I say that in a good way. Like, it's such an emotional and captivating experience that one is enough.
It's a journey through darkness. It is a play on morality and on madness. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of a war film that's not really about war. And that's what stuck with me in this viewing of it. And it's what's, I think, going to stick with us as we move on, because the way that Apocalypse Now really put the idea of war being hell on cinema is going to play a big, big role in our next film. And BK, whereas I set this up last week, I know you gush about this film, as I want you to set up for our listeners what they're going to experience next time they tune into Revenge of the Film Nerds.
Oh, next week we are going big or going home. BK is your local weep. So I have to throw in animated films in our podcast. That would be a waste. So next week we're going to be diving into Princess Mononoke. Oh my gosh, an absolute classic. And we're going to be exploring so many themes that are in there, studying a little bit the work of Hayao Miyazaki and the Studio Ghibli, and really getting to kind of see what arguably for me is what got Miyazaki such recognition is this film, between its themes, its execution, and honestly just overall tone. I think Hayao Miyazaki is an expert in feeling and emotion, And I think coming out of the gripping madness of Apocalypse Now and in sort of the mystic and fantasy realm of Princess Mononoke, we still tackle such heavy themes of war and horror in a different lens. So I'm super, super excited for next week.
And I'm pumped too, because whereas in this experience, Apocalypse Now is a film that is near and dear to my heart. And so a lot of this was, me putting you on to a lot of the nuances of the film. I'm thrilled to be watching Princess Mononoke again, even as somebody who's seen it, with the knowledge that you know infinitely more about the grounding foundations of this film, and you know more about Studio Ghibli and about Miyazaki than I do. And I'm so excited to pick your brain about what this film means, what the significance of it is specifically to Japanese culture, and ultimately what it is that resonates about this film for you as somebody who really uses it as a gateway into Japanese culture.
Oh boy, you guys are not going to want to miss next week. And we have tons of awesome films in our season schedule that are going to be coming out every week to you for the Revenge of the Film Nerds. We are going to be live on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Stay tuned. We're coming to you. So stick around and we'll hope to see you next week. I'm Black Crystal.
I'm Jack Manley. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. Peace and chicken grease.
Janet.